Hi, everybody. We've got a number of folks on the line with a bunch more folks registered, so we'll give them a couple minutes to hop on, and probably around 3:05 we'll get started, maybe a little bit earlier if folks are hopping in. So bear with us a little bit. I see a number of new folks have hopped on, so welcome. We're waiting a couple more minutes for folks to log in, and then we'll get started. As more folks are logging in, I'll just go ahead and run through a few of the logistics so that we can be sure to maximize folks' time. I want to be cognizant that a lot of folks are already on. So just on behalf of the National Juvenile Justice Network, I wanted to thank everybody for joining. Today, we're going to talk about the national trends and reducing transfers of youth to adult courts. And we have the Campaign for Youth Justice's Brian Evans with us. It's the third and final webinar we've co-hosted with the Campaign for Youth Justice, and you can catch the other two recordings, which were on Raise the Age and jail removal, both online on our website. And just as folks are getting settled, again, a couple of housekeeping items. So if you can just mute yourself, I think everybody should be muted. We will have some time for discussion and Q&A at the end, at which point we encourage you to either enter your question into the question box, or if you'd prefer, you can raise your hand and we can make sure to call on you there. We will make a recording of this webinar available. Hopefully folks got that in the email, but it will be available on our website in hopefully tomorrow, but definitely this weekend. We'll send out the recording link once it is up. I think those are about the only things in terms of the platform we need to go over. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Brian, just to get started.
Sure. Sure. Well, thank you, Allison. For those who don't know me, my name is, here it is. Brian Evans. I'm the State Campaigns Director at the Campaign for Youth Justice. Today I'll be talking about, on the slide there, it says automatic transfer, probably a little more than just automatic, but mainly the kinds of transfer of children where juvenile court judges have little or no discretion. It's the main way children are transferred to the adult court, aside from states that have not raised the age, which is the main way. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about Campaign for Youth Justice. Our mission or our goal is to end the practice of prosecuting, incarcerating, and sentencing youth under 18 as adults. Today, obviously, we'll be talking about prosecuting and sentencing parts of that. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our national sort of main strategy is to work with states to build campaigns, and we're called the Campaign for Youth Justice. Everything's about campaigning campaigns that involve coalitions, organizing, advocacy, research, media, all those sort of tactics together to pursue legislative changes, permanent, sustainable legislative changes to get children out of the adult criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our anchor campaigns at the Campaign for Youth Justice are, as you see, raise the age. As I said, where most children are transferred. Removing children from adult jails and prisons, which was the topic of our last webinar. And then today's topic, our goal to end or reduce the use of more or less automatic transfer of children to the adult system. In a broader sense, we would like to end all transfers, including those done by judges with full discretion, but that's not a major campaign of ours right now. Next slide, please. Thank you. So 40 states and Washington, D.C. have changed laws to get children out of the adult system, either the jails, either raise the age laws or reducing transfer, and we'll be talking about some of those. Next slide, please. Thank you. The federal laws, as you all know, JJDPA and PREA, designed the parts that we're concerned with that get children out of adult jails and prisons, have also had the effect of encouraging states to reduce the transfer of children, because the easiest way to keep children out of adult jails and prisons is to not charge them or prosecute them as adults. Next slide, please. Thank you. As a result of all these laws changing, we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of children who are charged as adults since early 2000s, when we opened up our doors in 2005, from 250,000 kids a year to, this is a statistic from 2015, 76,000 children. So that's a huge 70% drop. And 2015 was before six states raised the age, and before California abolished all of its transfer mechanisms, automatic transfer mechanisms. So that number has already dropped a lot further than it is now. Next slide. Thank you. So automatic transfer, for the purposes of this webinar, that's the transfer of children to the adult court with limited or no judicial review. It's, as you all probably know, applied to children of certain ages for certain offenses, as opposed to, say, states that haven't raised the age, where it applies to all children regardless of offense. Since in recent years, I'd say in the past decade or so, 9 states have repealed an automatic transfer provision. Another 9 states that have not repealed a provision have narrowed an automatic transfer provision, and another 6 states have added or expanded reverse waiver, which helps to mitigate the damage of transfer provisions. And on the next slide, you'll see a map of these states. Blue is the states that have repealed a provision, yellow have narrowed, and green have had some sort of addition or expansion of reverse waiver. So basically half the country in the last decade or so has moved in a positive direction on this issue. And it's geographically pretty much all over the place. So that's really a good sign that for the future that we keep moving forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the types of automatic transfer I'll be talking about, there's the kind that does involve a juvenile court judge, presumptive and mandatory transfer. There's statutory exclusion, in which children basically start in the adult system. There's prosecutor discretion, in which the prosecutor gets to decide. And then there's the once an adult, always adult provision, in which a child is basically statutorily excluded if they have a prior adult conviction or a prior adult transfer. So those are the ones I'm going to be talking about. Next slide. Thank you. So the first one, the presumptive waiver, this is sort of not really mandatory. It's on a continuum between waiver where a judge has full discretion and mandatory. The child has to prove that they should not be transferred. That's very hard to do, obviously. Judges are kind of predisposed to side with prosecutors and not the accused. And in any event, 3 states have repealed their presumptive waiver provisions in recent years. You see them there: California, Kansas, New Jersey. 2 others have narrowed their provisions, including Utah, which did so this year. Utah did some great things this year. Right now, 11 states and Washington, D.C. still use presumptive waiver. Next slide, please. Thank you. Mandatory waiver is still involves a juvenile court judge, but the judge basically has to waive the child to the adult court if the judge finds probable cause. In a few states, it's actually even the bar is even lower than that if the judge finds that the child is the proper age, for example, in Connecticut. So there is a juvenile court judge involved, but their discretion is extremely limited, and they're basically automatic. 3 states have repealed this provision from their laws: Georgia, Illinois, Rhode Island, and 2 states have narrowed their provisions for mandatory waiver both the exact same way in the exact same year. You see Connecticut, New Jersey raising the age to 15 in 2015. There are about 12 states, or there are exactly 12 states, I should say, that still use mandatory waiver. Next slide, please. Thank you. Statutory exclusion is sort of the big one. It's the state or the transfer mechanism that's most used, and I think probably, well, between that and prosecutor discretion transfers the most children. Confusingly for me, if not for other people, this is also called in many states direct file, a mandatory direct file, which in other states is applied to prosecutor discretion. So it gets the terminology gets a little confusing. So we're going with statutory exclusion. And this basically, with this provision, the legislative branch has decided where a child should be prosecuted, not the judiciary. There are 3 states that have repealed their statutory exclusion provisions: California, and then last year Florida and Oregon, which was very exciting to see a change like that in Florida, and to see Oregon overturn a referendum that was passed in 1994. They had to overturn it with a 2/3 majority, and they did so. 6 other states have narrowed their statutory exclusion provisions either by raising the age of eligibility or narrowing the list of offenses. Again, Utah this year did so, and that's really great to see. 26 states, more than half the country, still does use this type of transfer, though. Next slide, please. Thank you. Prosecutor discretion, again, also known as direct file. So we're going to say prosecutor discretion. This is the provision where the executive branch gets to decide where a child is charged, as opposed to the judiciary. Again, for certain offenses and certain ages. 2 states have repealed this provision: Connecticut, California, and Vermont. 3 others have narrowed their provisions, including Virginia this year, which raised the floor of eligibility to age 16, which was great to see. Currently, there are 12 states plus Washington, D.C. that use prosecutor discretion. I would hazard to say if Washington, D.C. were a state instead of a federal colony, they would probably vote to repeal prosecutor discretion, but it's hard to do that kind of thing in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is the once an adult, always an adult. It's more or less a kind of statutory exclusion applied to children that have a previous conviction in adult court, or in the case of 5 states, not even a previous conviction, but a previous transfer. This hasn't been a lot of action in terms of reform in this area compared to the other provisions. Illinois did repeal its once an adult provision in 2015, and 2 other states quite a number of years ago reformed it to require an adult conviction. And as you see, the majority of states in Washington, D.C. do have this kind of provision. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is not an automatic transfer provision. It's a way to mitigate an automatic transfer, and that's a reverse waiver, in which a child gets to challenge their transfer and possibly get sent back to juvenile court. Reverse waivers vary widely from state to state, depending on, as you see, standard approved, what can be challenged, what factors a judge can consider. That there are very weak reverse waivers, there are very strong reverse waivers. There are all kinds of reverse waivers. But 6 states have added reverse waiver in recent years of one form or another, and 3 of the states have expanded their provisions to apply to more children in more cases. Maryland's is particularly stands out because they are one of the top users of statutory exclusion, and they have a pretty strong reverse waiver provision that sends a lot of children back to the juvenile court. There are 30 states that have some form of reverse waiver. It should be 50 plus DC, but hopefully we'll get there on that. Next slide, please. So there are other ways to mitigate automatic transfer beyond changing legislation, encouraging best practices with prosecutors, meaning making sure they know what their underlings are doing, making sure they sign off on things, not charging kids with the highest offense every time. I think training juvenile court judges to use whatever discretion at their disposal to do the right things. As we're talking with transfer cases, a lot of the times we're talking about allegations or offenses or accusations of violent offenses. So working with children who engage in violence is critical to reducing the use of automatic transfer. And then a key piece of all of this is going to be data collection, recidivism data to show probably that automatic transfer does not really contribute to better recidivism rates. But collecting that data would be extremely important and should be encouraged. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the data thing is a big deal. It's not collected very well. OJDP collects the data on transfers by judge, but they do not collect automatic transfer data. The data that states collect is spotty. Not all states collect all data. Not all states that do collect data collect it every year. As I've mentioned, the terminology varies. What's direct file? What they're counting can be, sometimes it's charges, sometimes they're counting cases, sometimes they're counting children. Obviously, those are not the same numbers. They're not very comparable. Most children might get more than one charge, for example. And even the states that do collect data do not collect data on racial and ethnic disparities. I think there's only 18 states that do that. So there's really a gap here in terms of what we know. What we do know based on the estimates of National Center for Juvenile Justice, the 2015 estimate of 76,000 that I mentioned earlier, that there are about 6,000 children transferred by statutory exclusion or prosecutor discretion every year, which is about twice as many as are judicially transferred, but only about a tenth of the number of children that end up in the adult system because their state has not raised the age. And the important thing to note with that, as I did earlier, 6 states have since 2015 raised the age, and California and Oregon have both eliminated their automatic transfer provisions. Florida omitted or repealed their statutory exclusion, so that there's already probably a major drop in the number of kids transferred, both because of raising age and because of the changes in statutory exclusion. But in 2015, there were about 10 states that accounted for, I'm guessing, and this is a very rough estimate, 2/3 to 3/4 of the 6,000 total. And you see them there. The states in blue are states that have repealed or reformed a transfer provision. The states in green did something good with reverse waiver, and Alabama and Pennsylvania have yet to enact any reforms. Those are the top 10 as of 2015. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, since California and Oregon have repealed their automatic transfer, that leaves us with 8 states. Now, Florida repealed its statutory exclusion, but they have prosecutor discretion that they use extensively, more than any other state in the country, on hundreds of kids a year. So Florida's numbers are still going to be very high. These are the numbers that I could gather. Some are more definitive than others. The Alabama, Pennsylvania numbers are sort of from news reports, not necessarily from data that's available. But you see that this is adding up to, these are the states responsible for the majority of automatic transfers in this country. Most of them, their numbers are going down. Maryland's went up from 2014 to 2016, and Ohio's have been going up primarily because of one county, Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland, where numbers have been going up significantly. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are no states that do not have some form of automatic transfer, because there are 6 states that have once an adult, always an adult provision, but no other form of automatic transfer. All 6 of these states also have judicial discretionary waiver. But these are the 6 states that, except for once an adult, always an adult, have no other form of automatic transfer. And it should be noted, of course, that states that only have judicial waiver can still transfer large numbers. Tennessee is a prime example of that. In 2014, over 200, in 2016, just under 200 cases were transferred, which would put it on that list from the previous slide of top transfer states. As you can see, in Tennessee, as in Ohio, it's one county that is significantly responsible, and that's Shelby County, where Memphis is. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's some the things that have happened in recent years that have helped to really change the landscape and make things look a lot better. Starting with California, where Prop 57, which passed in 2016, eliminated all three kinds of automatic transfer that California had. Huge victory. They followed that up 2 years later with a legislation that raised the floor on judicial transfers to age 16. As a result, they've seen their transfers drop from several hundred a year to under 100. So California probably gets the prize for the biggest changes. As I've been mentioning, Utah has had 2 rounds of reform, one in 2015 and one this year, which illustrates that if you do enact some good changes and the sky doesn't fall, you can go get a second bite of the apple and push things further. And Utah has done a really great job of sort of adopting that approach. And then there are 4 raise the age states that accompanied or followed their raise the age laws with changes on automatic transfer. Connecticut, as you see, raised the floor on mandatory waiver after passing raise the age. Illinois repealed mandatory waiver once an adult and narrowed their statutory exclusion. North and South Carolina both included things as part of their raise the age law. North Carolina included reverse waiver. South Carolina raised the floor for their statutory exclusion law to 17, which is really great, except that South Carolina statutory excludes a whole lot of offenses. But raising the age to 17 is a big deal. And North Carolina, of course, followed their raise the age law with a jail removal law last year. So those are some examples of states that have done some things in stages, and hopefully things that maybe some of you all can take the lead and follow up on. Next slide, please. So associations in support of ending automatic transfer. We have a whole list of these on our website. At the last slide of this presentation, there's a list of resources that a lot of this information comes from. For running a campaign, I'll point out National Association of Counties and the National Sheriff's Association, which are not sort of your usual suspects, and Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators as well. These are good tools to sort of recruit local sheriffs, local counties, and to show legislators that this is ending automatic transfer or reducing automatic transfer is not some crazy scheme, that the people most involved in the system believe that automatic transfer should be ended. Next slide, please. So there's work remaining to do, even though we've had almost half the states make some changes. These are the 4 R's, kind of cheesy, but repeal, restrict, reverse, as in reverse waiver, and require an adult conviction for those states, those 5 states that don't, that have once an adult. You could repeal once an adult as well and not just require an adult conviction. But those are sort of the high level ways of addressing and trying to reform transfer. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another aspect of work that can be done is locally. As I mentioned, Cuyahoga County, you can see the data there, responsible for about a third of transfers in 2014, responsible for 43% in 2018, and most of the rest of the state was staying flat, and they were going up. And this is all because of one prosecutor. So they can make a big difference who's in the office of prosecutor, and you'll see the next example, the 4th Judicial Circuit of Florida, the main city there is Jacksonville. Lots of transfers. It was the #1 transferring jurisdiction in this. This is all mostly because of prosecutor discretion. The #1 transferring jurisdiction in Florida. A new prosecutor took office, changed protocols and procedures, and all of a sudden the numbers are half what they were. So local changes, not even on the legislative level, but political changes, just sort of practical changes of how the work gets done can make a big difference in the certain jurisdictions. Next slide, please. All right, so data, this is the one that's a real problem for us. As I mentioned, only 18 states disaggregate data by race. I've pulled some of the states where that data is available, if only for actual transfers. And you can see that the racial disparities are very bad. If you look at the percentage of white people transferred, it's very low compared to other groups. This is just transfers. If you were collecting data on convictions and sentencing, it would probably be even worse. And that's why we were excited in 2018 when Indiana passed a law that, and you see the requirements there on the slide. Excuse me. All sorts of data that has to be published, not just on transfers, but on the outcomes, on the convictions, on the sentences. So you can really get a handle on the racial disparities that are, I have no doubt, happening in every state that is using automatic transfer on children. So I highly recommend that states try to push for a law like this to get a handle on what's happening in their states with transfer. Next slide, please. So this is what is needed to continue this work. This is sort of a set of questions for you all to ask, and then to ask us how we can help. What needs to be documented? What national data do you need? What kind of resources do you need to push on this issue? The big question that everybody's sort of thinking about, given all the releases or attempts to get people released during COVID-19 and all the sort of activism that has been energized and organized around this, how can that be, or can it be leveraged on this particular issue? The other issue that's not on this slide, the bankrupt state budgets in the coming years, how is that going to impact automatic transfer or any other kind of criminal justice reform? Next slide, please. Thank you. More questions. Do we need national leadership on this? What barriers exist in your state? Every state has barriers, of course. What are the stakeholders you most need support from? And then, of course, after this, I'm done. Hopefully, we will have questions from you all, concerns, ideas. I'd love to hear them all now or afterwards. Next slide, please. Almost done. And so just to sort of end this, in terms of Campaign for Youth Justice, as many of you know, we are a campaign that has largely moved the needle in the right direction. Even this year's truncated legislative sessions, we saw states like Virginia and Utah passing really good, strong laws. So we are phasing ourselves out of existence this year. So what this webinar series has been about largely is to gather information from you about what you need for the rest of this year and for the foreseeable future, so we can decide how best to sort of develop resources over the summer, identifying the states that need the most support. We are going to be publishing our final trends report in October that will cover the years 2018, 2019, 2020, but also maybe hopefully have a broader sort of overview like this presentation did of changes over the entire period of our existence going back to 2006, 2007. And we'll be working at the Sentencing Project next year to actively support 4 or 5 states pushing major reforms. We'll have to, again, the COVID-19 throws a lot of things into question as to what's possible. I think things are possible now that weren't before. There may be other things that are less possible now than there were before, particularly things involving money. So there's going to be a lot of sort of assessment over the course of the rest of the year at Campaign for Youth Justice, and we really need your help letting us know what you need and how you think we can help. So next slide, please. The next steps, this is the last of the 3 webinars, the one on raise the age, the one on jail removal, and this is the one on transfer. The next step will be to get this one up available online that you can reference and share widely, and will remain up for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. And I guess it's the last slide. These are the resources I mentioned earlier. We produced a few reports over the years on this issue, a couple of state reports, one on Iowa, one on disproportionate prosecution of Black youth in New Jersey. The color of juvenile transfers, a report on racial disparities that we did with the National Association of Social Workers. The importance of the last one there, youth transfer, the importance of individualized factor review, has some really good recommendations for prosecutors and judges that can be sort of taken to prosecutors and judges without the need for legislative change. So I think that one's really important. We have also on this list the estimate that I've been mentioning from 2015 of 76,000 children, prosecutors, adults from NJJN. And then the policy statements and recommendations also there on this list that I think can be quite helpful for states trying to rally stakeholders to support reforms. And then finally, raising the floor is a report we did on raising the minimum age of prosecution of youth as adults. This is what a lot of states have done with their automatic transfer statutes, short of repealing them, is to raise the floor to 16 or 15, or in the case of South Carolina, 17. So that's a good tactic that has worked well in a lot of states. And that's a report that might help you with that. I think that's it for me. I hope I didn't talk too fast. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer as many as I can.
Yeah, so thank you, Brian. We already have a few questions that have come in, and folks hopefully can add to these. So I'm going to go through the substantive questions, and then there's a few housekeeping questions, so I will cover those before the end. But hold on. So is there a way to know where your state sits on these transfer issues, for example, in Georgia?
Sure. We can, you mean knowing what your laws are, or knowing what changes you've made? I mean, we certainly have that information and happy to share it. I know that Georgia repealed mandatory transfer and was in the process of passing a raise the age bill before the COVID-19 hit. Georgia has prosecutor discretion. Georgia has statutory exclusion, I think, if I recall correctly. So there's a lot of transfer mechanisms in Georgia, but any state, not off the top of my head necessarily, I don't have that in front of me, but I can tell you what provisions you have, and we can go from there, I guess.
Sure, and I apologize, everybody. My computer is being a little funky in terms of questions. It's not liking, not allowing me to show the PowerPoint and the questions at the same time. So there's another question from Rachel Johnson, and I'm just trying to get that up for you. I can see it, but I can't actually read it. So let me try a couple things, and I do apologize, guys. Let's see if my computer decides to be nicer. There we go. So Rachel is in Maryland, and she's saying she's doing juvenile transfer work from adult back to juvenile. And the data is really lacking. The number of youth charged by county, the number of those charged gets dismissed, and outcomes for juveniles who are not transferred back to juvenile court. So she knows that part of the battle is the statewide office creating tools to track this data on our end, but she's also looking for tools to do that so it can be easily implemented. So is wondering what Maryland specific data is being collected outside of their office.
Yeah, I mean, you'll probably have seen on the slide that the number I had for Maryland was from 2016, and that's from a DJS report. Yeah, it's just not being collected. And we have, as you know, in Maryland, a Juvenile Justice Reform Council right now looking at, as the name would imply, juvenile justice reform. Certainly data collection has been on everyone's mind. They've hired Vera to, and we've already talked with them about Maryland's data problems. So it is a huge problem in Maryland, and I think there needs to be legislative fixes to require data to be collected and published, which does not exist now, unfortunately. So we just don't, in terms of, we sort of know transfer, but as you said, we don't know, convictions. We have the reverse waiver in Maryland is used a lot, but more in some counties than others. It's just a big mess. And I think if we can get the Reform Council to recommend methodology with the support of Vera that will work, and then get that passed into legislation, I think we can at least start to collect data, but there's no reason we can't at least start restricting Maryland's transfer statute without data. Maryland has 33 separate offenses for which children are automatically statutory excluded, which is, I think, higher than any other state, or just about as high as any other state. There's no reason that can't be restricted in the right political climate even without data. So there's no easy answers to that. It's just because it's not being collected. And we do have this opportunity with the Juvenile Justice Reform Council and with Vera working with the Juvenile Justice Reform Council to come up with some really good data collection approaches that Maryland can adopt, hopefully next year. I'm sorry, we probably didn't answer your question very well, but.
She actually has a follow-up question, wondering whether there's a toolkit or a template that is available that would make data collection in the state easier.
Not that I know of. Any state in particular, like sort of tips for data collection kind of thing?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
I mean, that sounds like a really good idea. Maybe that we can add that to, as I said, we want ideas of things we should create over the summer. That's a great idea for something to do. I don't know that there is one. There might be one. Maybe a group like Vera has something like that. We don't have something like that I know of. But that's an excellent idea.
Great. A couple other questions coming through. So one is just, where does New Mexico stand in all of this?
Oh gosh. Again, off the top of my head, I don't have that data right in front of me. I can look it up on my computer. New Mexico.
And just while you're busy looking at that, I'll just weigh in that a lot of folks have expressed interest in that toolkit as well. So
Okay, yeah, it's a great idea.
there's
So, yeah, I have a list of states. New Mexico has a little weird actually. They have statutory exclusion, but nothing else. Not even judicial transfer. They just have statutory exclusion. That much I can tell you. I don't know of any reforms that have happened in the time that I've been working here, but again, that they don't have a lot of transfer mechanisms, so there's not that much to reform. So in Georgia, yeah, Georgia has statutory exclusion and prosecutor discretion, a form of reverse waiver, and they need to raise the age. So Georgia has a lot of ways to transfer children to the adult court.
Thank you. I think those are the questions that have come in. If other folks have additional questions, please feel free to type them in and we'll be sure to raise them with Brian. Brian, I, for whatever reason, cannot show the slide with your questions to the group at the same time as asking the questions to you. Are there any specific questions from that slide that you want to raise for folks to respond to here?
Let me pull it up real quick. There it is. I mean, we want to know, and that question about how to collect data is a classic example. We just want to know where your gaps are, either in terms of sort of tactics to pass laws or ways to get information. We want to know what gaps we can fill. So yeah, and I mean, I'd love to hear just sort of, maybe not now, but whenever you want to talk to sort of what the barriers, if you've tried to change your transfer laws and run into a roadblock, what that roadblock was, or if you're from a state that has changed transfer laws, how did you do it? That kind of information we'd love to get from you, just sort of to help share with other states, just the successes and the lessons learned from things that weren't successful. And yeah, so we'd love to hear from you, just from your experiences and what kind of toolkits or practical sort of help or support you would need in the coming years that we can work on putting together before we go out of business.
Yeah, so I don't know if folks have responses to that. If you want to write them in the question box, or if you want to raise your hand, I'm able to see folks. We do have quite a few states represented. I see we've got, well, we clearly have New Mexico and Georgia, but and Maryland and Texas and Illinois. So if folks have thoughts from their own advocacy experience they want to share with the group, or tools that you think would be helpful moving forward, please jump in. Just trying to go through and make sure I haven't missed any hands raised. Y'all are quiet today. Well, there are some follow-up questions just in terms of logistics, so I will answer those. And if anyone has additional thoughts or feedback from Brian,
I just want to can I just reiterate one more thing with COVID-19? I know just from doing local work in Maryland, and y'all are probably all doing things locally in your communities, that the sort of opportunities it presents in terms of people authorities realizing that they're jailing way, or maybe presented with the possibility of realizing that they're incarcerating way too many people. That opportunity and the opportunity of the way in a lot of places people are really organizing in order to get testing and to get people out. And how do we take advantage of that organizing once things go back to whatever the new normal is and the legislatures get back in session? How do we take advantage of that to push legislative changes that fit with what we're learning here, which is that we are locking up way too many people. And the other part of it is the economic bankruptcy that's coming in so many of our states, and figuring out how to address the challenge to every proposal that, oh, we can't pay for that. So I'm happy to sort of think that through with everybody. Obviously, everybody's going to have to think it through. That's just a thing that's going to be out there as we roll towards 2021. If we are proposing things that require any sort of expenditure, we're going to hit that roadblock. But there are ways to talk about it, and that could be another sort of toolkit that we put together as how to reform youth justice in a time of lack of economic resources. So I'll just end there. I just wanted to sort of throw that out there because it wasn't part of the presentation, but I know that probably all of us have been involved in just emergency response in our local communities. And there's a lot of possible, I don't want to say positive, but some strong organizing and some lessons possibly learned that are happening now that we need to take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And I know that we've seen some great practices, right, and some concerning practices
Yes.
in COVID. And so really trying to elevate the best practices and move those forward and really implement them. There's one question in terms of what's the best way to get in touch with you, Brian, after the presentation, whether it's email or another form of contact. So we can share that with folks, but I don't know if you have that right now.
I don't know if I put that on the presentation or not. I guess if it's going to go up on the internet, I'm glad I didn't. But yeah, email is fine. Does everybody have my email, or can you send it to everybody?
We can send it around with the slides and the recording, but
I can say it also, but
go for it. Say it too.
Sometimes there's a loss in translation. It's just B as in boy, Evans, EVANS, my first initial and my last name, at CFYJ.org. So first initial, last name, CFYJ.org, and my name is Brian Evans. So.
And we'll be sure to share that email with folks who
That's
register.
the best way. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from you all, because I mean, we just want to know what to do over the rest of this year to make sure everybody has as much of what they need as possible to keep the work going.
And then the last sort of housekeeping question that was raised, unless folks have last minute questions, and feel free to input them, but is we will make the PowerPoint available. It'll be available in addition with the recording. And like we said, Brian's email we can include just in the text as well. Not on the internet, Brian, don't worry.
Okay. And it's okay. It's already all over the internet anyway. It doesn't matter.
I'm sure. And then in terms of a certificate of attendance, we typically send to everyone who attended, like just saying that they have, thank you for attending. If you need something more specific, if you want to email us, we can try to meet whatever specific needs folks need in terms of a certificate of attendance. So those are the only questions I'm seeing. And with that, I'll say, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, as a follow-up, we'll probably create some like little one-page fact sheets about transfer, just a different form of the same information. And the list of states and their laws, you know, where does my state stand in all of this? It's a big spreadsheet now, which I'm trying to figure out how to make it look nicer, but we'll publish that information at some point as well. So I know that, you know, JJGPS was the go-to for everybody, including us, but they stopped sort of updating in 2016. So the information is not necessarily up to date. So we'll do a really cheap and dirty version of that. Oh, my phone's ringing, great. So we'll do a cheap and dirty version of that we'll get up soon as well. But I can answer any questions about states to the best of my ability, and happy to talk with anybody about any of this.
Thank you so much, Brian. We really appreciate it
Sure.
and the background, and we'll be sure to share this and your information with everybody. So we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
yeah, we'll end early. Thank you all and enjoy your extra 10 minutes. Bye.
Bye.